Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome. My name is Paul Harrison, and on behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies and the Stanford Humanities Center, I'd like to welcome you this evening. Our colleagues at the Humanities Center have invited me to ask you that if you're interested in their events, there'll be a sign-up sheet. There it is. It'll be available on the way out if you want to be kept informed of their program. So it is a great pleasure for me tonight to welcome Dr. Mimi Gates. It's always good for Stanford to welcome one of its own. Dr. Gates did a bachelor's degree here and then went on to study in Paris at the University of Iowa and finally at Yale, where she did her PhD in Chinese painting. And since then she's taught at a number of institutions, notably Yale, Wesleyan University, and more recently at the University of Washington in Seattle. And she's also held various positions as curator of Asian art at the Yale University Art Gallery, and eventually she became the director of that art gallery. But in '94, she moved to Seattle to take up the directorship of the Seattle Art Museum, a post she held for approximately 15 years, and she is now the Director Emerita of the Seattle Art Museum. So in addition to all the exhibitions she's curated on Chinese, Japanese, Tibetan, and even Indian art, Dr. Gates has been very active in public life and has held positions on various foundations, including the San Francisco Asian Art Museum Foundation, the Yale Corporation, the Blakemore Foundation, and particularly relevant for this evening, the Dunhuang Foundation, of which she has been the chair since 2011. So I can think of no one better qualified to address us on tonight's topic, and her talk is entitled From Dunhuang, China to the Getty Center, Los Angeles, Opportunities and Challenges of Exhibiting Buddhist Art or Buddhist Cave Temples and their art. So Mimi, welcome to Stanford, or welcome back to Stanford, and we look forward to hearing what you have to tell us.
I will just say it's a great delight to be here, and I want to thank John Kieschnick and Paul Harrison for inviting me to come. It actually was while I was an undergraduate at Stanford that Asia and museums became my dual passions. And the shift in focus from Europe to Asia, from Dante to Chinese history and art history. And I also did an independent study in the bowels of the museum building that is now the Cantor Center, cataloging Leland Stanford's toys. And somehow that led to a very long career in museums. I became completely fascinated. And many people think of art museums as solely about beauty. I think of museums as a history from things. Libraries provide words and books, but museums provide objects. And if you're going to do words, you have to be literate. If you do objects, anybody can make an object, so it's actually without class. So they're made by a much broader swath. And that's an approach that was actually instilled in me by Jules Prown, who is a professor of the history of art at Yale. So what information, what ideas can you glean from objects? What do they say not only about the person who created them, the people for whom they were made, about their function, but also about the time period to which they belong? So this should look familiar to some of you, I hope. So Ai Weiwei, in the small catalog that accompanies the exhibition, which is currently at Alcatraz, states, I try to make my work honestly to reflect the place and time in which I live. And his exhibition on view at Alcatraz through April 26th, it's a fine example of how powerful visual imagery can be. And this is only one part of it, the handmade kites. intended to soar freely and so central to traditional Chinese life. And here they're paradoxically confined within a prison, like caged flight. And what a powerful metaphor for his struggle for the freedom of expression, not only in China, but even beyond. And if you haven't seen it, go. It's terrific. But Ai Weiwei is a contemporary artist. What happens if you go back in time and tackle the challenge of how to create a compelling exhibition of Buddhist cave temples of Dunhuang, chock full of Buddhist sculpture and wall paintings? You can see here, every inch of the caves are covered, but they're fixed in situ. They don't travel. So this is actually not an abstract exercise. I'm part of a team of academics, curators, and conservators who are organizing a major exhibition that will take place at the Getty in Los Angeles, and it'll be on view in the summer of 2016 from May 7th to September 4th, 2016. And it's in partnership with the Dunhuang Academy. And I'll show you an image in just a minute. But why the Getty Center? The Getty Center is best known for European art, not for Asian art. But it is at the Getty, there is a conservation center. And that is one thing that is critical. But I'll just show you, it's in partnership with the Dunhuang Academy and a view of the caves. But the Getty Conservation Institute is one of the four parts that comprise the Getty Trust. And they work on projects in many parts of the world at major sites. And they've had a presence at Dunhuang for over 25 years. And what this exhibition celebrates is that long-term collaboration between the Getty and the Dunhuang Academy. The Dunhuang Academy is in charge of all the caves. They handle everything from scholarship to security. And it's actually quite an extraordinary place. And they've been very innovative in reaching out to other parts of the world, because you think of Dunhuang as being isolated up in the corner of northwest China, and yet they've reached out to international organizations all over in order to enhance the expertise, the way they manage the site, and certainly conservation. And so the reason the Getty is doing the project is because of this long-term conservation partnership. And actually one of the challenges is how to incorporate their conservation work in the exhibition. This is an image of conservators, one from the Academy and one from the Getty, examining the wall paintings in Cave 85, which is a project which was a collaboration between the two for over 10 years. And they're examining it with UV light. So the Dunhuang Academy actually is become very sophisticated. So an image of the large, you can't see this anymore because it's now fully enclosed, but this is a photograph taken by Langdon Warder in 1924, rather haunting image of the head of the large Buddha that actually is 34.5 meters high, and part of the cliff had fallen away. And there's no substitute for experiencing firsthand a site like Dunhuang and its magnificence. But we actually have an opportunity doing this exhibition to give visitors a visceral sense of the place. What is the place like? And engage them in exploring the Silk Road, the intriguing mix of cultures on the Silk Road, Greek and Roman, Persian and Middle Eastern, Indian and Central Asian, and Chinese. And to my mind, equally important is the spiritual faith and beliefs that are fundamental to the commissioning, the creation, and the function of these Buddhist cave temples and their art. This is a place of spirituality. It's a meaningful place of devotion and merit gaining. The wall paintings, sculpture, and other works of art at Dunhuang, they're not art for art's sakes, but they're rather objects of devotion, integral to the Buddhist faith, and thus they need to be studied and displayed in historical, art historical, and religious context. So how to create a balance is part of our challenge. So what I propose to do this evening is first provide a very brief refresher introduction to the Buddhist cave temples of Dunhuang. And no doubt many of you have visited there, and it's a must-see World Heritage Site, but some of you may not be familiar, so I'll just very quickly touch on the basic story. And then the second part, I'll take a quick look at the Getty 2016 Dunhuang exhibition and show you just a small sampling of objects which will be in that exhibition. The exhibition is certainly a work in progress, and I have no doubt in the year ahead that there will be many changes, but it's rapidly taking shape. And then I'll consider challenges and opportunities, including possible uses of immersive technology. So how can we maximize the 2016 Dunhuang exhibition project at the Getty? How can we make it informative, compelling, spark people's curiosity, and reinvest the spiritual component that speaks Buddhism? So first, a quick introduction. So Dunhuang is strategically located in the Heshi corridor on the Chinese end of the Silk Road. And it was here that merchants and monks, pilgrims left China to go west, and also where they arrived coming back to China. It was vibrant, it was a cosmopolitan place where East met West, and where all these major cultures intersected with one another for over 1,000 years. So in a broad sense, Dunhuang includes 5 cave complexes: the Mogao Caves, the Yulin Caves, I think you can see them better than I can up there, the West Thousand Buddha Caves, the East Thousand Buddha Caves, and the 5 cave temples at Subei. But little art survives at any of those cave complexes except at Yulin and Mogao. So if you go to Dunhuang, don't miss Yulin. And it dates all the way from Northern Wei to Yuan. It has a huge span, but it's best known for its late Tang and Xisha art. And this, in Cave 3, Samantabhadra, riding on the elephant, is masterpiece. This is a cave complex that has been very little studied and is of terrific importance. There's a Sung landscape above Samantabhadra that ranks with the best. And on the right, you see just the small river valley, the narrow gorge where the Yulin Caves are located, with a river running through it that makes just a wonderful sound. It's a very special place. But Mogao is, in a narrow sense, that's what people refer to when they say the caves of Dunhuang. They're all cut into a composite rock scarp that's almost 1 mile long. And it's Mogao, which in 1987 was designated a World Heritage Site. These are the northern caves where the monks lived, did some worship. They were buried here. And these caves are largely undecorated in this section. But there is one great Tibetan cave up here, 465. But if you go to the southern section of the 735 caves at Mogao, 492 are filled with painting and sculpture, and they are primarily in this southern section. This is actually a bit of an old photograph because it's much more neatly organized now and much safer to walk. But I rather like this photograph. What distinguishes Mogao from other cave sites? It's not only the large number of caves and the vast amount of wall painting and sculpture. There's 45,000 square meters of wall painting that survives at Mogao, and over 2,000 Buddhist sculptures. It really is the best preserved of all cave temples. It also is the only site that satisfies all the 6 criteria of UNESCO for a World Heritage Site. But it also, the art spans 1,000 years, from the 4th to the 14th century, which, that's a huge period of time. And it goes from the early caves of the 6 dynasties of the 5th and 6th century. On the left, Cave 275 Maitreya with Maitreya, and on the right, 249, which is a Western Way cave and also one of the greats, to the magnificent Sui and Tang caves of the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. And this is from Cave 45. And I will just mention that, that the Dunhuang Academy is also photographing every inch of wall painting to create a high-resolution digital record of Dunhuang, with the idea that if there ever is an earthquake or if there's ever massive destruction, they will have a record of what Dunhuang was. But also, obviously, you can use it for a lot of other ways, for study, and you can see how sharp the images are. And in the later caves, it goes up to the 14th century, 13th, 14th century to the Yuan dynasty. And one of the great masterpieces is Avalokiteshvara in Cave 3. And if you look carefully at this, you can see in the hands of her this very beautiful control of line that of each of the hands with the eyes in them. And whereas you have much more expressive brushwork in the silk garment that's wearing, all of this bespeaks what happens in Chinese painting and the reliance on line. So if these wall paintings and sculpture can't be moved, cannot travel, how in the world do you do an exhibition and put together an exhibition of Dunhuang? So where did the 40 portable objects at Dunhuang come from? The ones that we're going to include in the show. Who found them and who owns them now? And a critical event, an event that stands out in the history of Dunhuang and in the history of 20th century China, is the Taoist monk Wang Yuanlu, who you see here, his discovery of the library cave, often referred to as Cave 17, on June 22nd, 1900. He was cleaning sand out of this passageway in Cave 16, and huge amounts of sand had accumulated. And he noticed that there was a space behind. So he came back at night and actually broke through the painting and found a storeroom with over 40,000 objects in it. Devotional objects, manuscripts, sutras, paintings, embroideries. And it was just an incredible treasure trove. And it's those objects, it's a very small selection that we will we will include in the exhibition. But I'll talk a little bit more about in so many different languages. So this was just at the moment when the Qing dynasty was falling and was disintegrating. The Chinese authorities would not pay attention to Daoist Wang, even the local authorities, when he mentioned what he had found. So nobody paid attention. So the first to arrive were the Foreign Devils of the Silk Road. And it's rather fascinating. And there's actually a great book by Peter Hopkirk called The Foreign Devils of the Silk Road that reads like a novel. And in 1907, Sir Aurel Stein arrived, and he purchased a significant portion, and by that I mean about 20,000 objects. He was working for the British government and the Indian government, and he was followed. Let's see, there's Aurel Stein and his dogs, and they're wonderful. In fact, he was so excited that when he left to go back, he was experienced at expeditions in Central Asia, but this time he was so excited by what he had found that he didn't pay enough attention and he lost some toes to frostbite. But he was followed by Paul Pelliot, and here you can get an idea of what this cave looked like. I mean, just an absolutely incredible treasure trove. And here Paul Pelliot is seen examining documents by candlelight. Pelliot could read Chinese, Stein could not. And so Pelliot actually picked choice things. He also picked a lot of the manuscripts in different languages, in Uyghur, in Turkic, in all kinds of different languages. And Stein's purchases are now housed in the British Museum and the British Library, and Pelliot's are divided between the Musée Guimet and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris. The remainder are scattered. Some small selection at Dunhuang. The Chinese National Library has quite a few, and the Hermitage, anyway, they're scattered all over. There is a project, the International Dunhuang Project at the British Library, which is documenting them all. But as art historian Sarah Fraser has pointed out, what makes Dunhuang so special is the fact that when you combine the library cave and its contents, sketches and other artist materials which she was studying, with the finished murals in the cave, Dunhuang remains the only complete artistic environment of pre-modern China to survive intact, which is quite something. And there you have the Musée Guimet. So we will borrow from the Musée Guimet, the Bibliothèque Nationale, the British Museum, and the British Library. Because these objects on paper and silk, they were created more than 1,100 years ago. They are extremely fragile. So the loan negotiations are complex. Fortunately, the Getty's a highly respected institution. They lend to London and to Paris, so that helps a great deal. And we have, fortunately, to date had a significant degree of success. However, there are restrictions in the exposure to light. The Musée Guimet, for example, will only permit their paintings to be exhibited for no more than 2 months. And the exhibition's 4 months, and only at the Getty, can't travel. But we'll change out the paintings because of that. And it is sort of a shame that it can't travel, but that's the way it is. One of the great pleasures of organizing an exhibition like this is studying the objects firsthand, studying the works of art. And you conceptualize your ideas, you shape what you're doing, and we have a team of people working on it. We did a preliminary selection, talked to the curators, what's available for loan, what's not, go back, readjust, come back. And it's an ongoing dialogue that involves considerable negotiation and diplomacy. And we decided early on to focus on Dunhuang. This is not a general Silk Road exhibition. And we also decided that in addition to introducing Dunhuang as a site on the Silk Road and Buddhism at Dunhuang, that we would focus on two themes: spirituality and artistic practice, and that's sort of the spirituality part, and then survival, conservation, and preservation, which is sort of the materiality part. And so how do we envision the experience at the Getty of the Dunhuang show? So you'll take the tram to the top of the hill. Many of you probably have been to the Getty. And actually, we have kind of a fun idea. And I think fun is underrated by museums, but we intend to paint camels on the outside of the tram. So it actually was an idea from the head of the Getty Trust. So I hope we can do it. But more importantly, and more seriously, how can we use the interior space in the tram to create a mood that's in keeping with the Buddhist experience that lies ahead? So both in the replica caves and tram we've talked about, is silence possible if you've got a crowd of people? But chanting of monks, recitation of sutras, how can we do that? And we're still really grappling with that. We want to make the Buddhist experience come alive. So the Getty is doing something quite extraordinary for this exhibition. On the lower plaza, they are building a structured tent, a temporary building to house 3 full-scale replica caves. And these caves, they are full-scale, and they are made by artists at Dunhuang. As you go in, there'll be a video introducing Dunhuang. It'll have captions but no sound. And then you'll have 3 caves, and I'll quickly run through the caves in a minute, 275, 285, and 320. And let me show you this is a diagram of what a assembled replica cave looks like on the outside. And in the upper right, an artist they work actually with traditional artistic techniques, with historical techniques to create these copies, using a brush to trade. It's a very complicated process, but as you go in, there'll be an introduction to Dunhuang on video, and as you leave, there'll be a video showing how the caves were made and describing that process, which is quite elaborate. It actually takes 2 to 3 years to make the replica caves. One thing that's nice about them is, in contrast to virtual reality, they're actually physical things you can touch. So, here, cave 275, and this is a view of the replica cave. This is a cave that dates to the 5th century, and it still is it's very heavily influenced by the art of Central Asia and the art to the west. It's very much like an Indian Chaitya hall, and the string drapery, the style of the Buddha. There's a lot of Persian influence in the crown. It shows this early style. 285 is 6th century, about a century later, and you have a fascinating mix. This is really one of the great caves. It's the earliest dated cave. It has 2 inscriptions dated 538 and 539. And you have on the ceiling of the Celestial Realm, you have Chinese Taoist mythology. It's combined with Buddhist deities, Buddhist narratives, and then right around the Buddha, you actually have Hindu deities, Shiva, Vishnu, so it's quite a mix. And from an artistic point of view, there's a lot of speculation as to whether the artists who worked on this came from central China. Who were they? It's quite an amazing cave. And they're making this specially for the Getty exhibition. And 320 from Tong, so Hai Tong, magnificent ceiling with a canopy in the center and the 1,000 Buddha design around the outside. And like many of these later caves, it has an illustration of a sutra, the Amitaya Sutra, in a very complex composition, and Maitreya in another part of that cave. So replication, it's an important sub-theme of the exhibition and an important part of spirituality and artistic practice. There's a wonderful book by Lothar Lederoth called 10,000 Things. Talks about the Chinese, how far ahead of everybody else they were in doing mass production. And he talks about replication and the role it plays in the creative process and how it's viewed very differently in China and the West. Whereas Westerners tend to look at reproduction as a work of art having lost its aura in a copy. Chinese felt they were emulating nature, and they produced a great deal through reproduction. And think about the practice of Chinese artists. They learned by copying. They copied the work that earlier artists had done. And that's what the artists at Dunhuang do today. They copy paintings over and over. And it is the way that traditionally the Chinese painters and calligraphers learned their art. So what do the replica caves represent? The replica caves offer immersive, replicated experience of sacred space. And if you think with virtual reality, and we will at the end hope have a exhibition, a technology component. But these caves, they have a physicality. They're full scale. One thing about the replica caves, you see the scale. It's 1-to-1. The minute you're in a virtual reality space, you have no sense of scale. And so we want to provide different experiences of the caves. So what about the spiritual component? How can we make the replica caves a spiritual experience? And it was in these spaces like the cave temples that worshipers encountered the divine. And so the question that haunts us is, how can we create a meaningful Buddhist experience? Well, how can we engage the senses? How can we engage sight, sound, smell to really make it have a different feeling? Okay, once we're going to leave the replica caves and you go up the grand staircase to the upper plaza and turn right, and there in this grove of trees is a monumental reclining Buddha. And I will say I'm cheating here because I'm showing you the original. But a parinirvana of the Buddha that's tongue and date. And it is one of the most important scenes in all of Buddhist art and literature. The Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, freed from all future rebirths and making his final passage into the state of nirvana and the cessation, transcendence of suffering. And the monumentality. This reclining Buddha is 15.6 meters long, so it's huge. And he will very appropriately be in the trees. And this is a detail of the head of the Buddha in cave 158. You can see the swirls of the hair that it evoked on Dharan art, the very full lips and the eyes, the very full face, Persian rondelles on the pillow. The this is one of really a superb example of Tang sculpture. And we're hoping that in the enclosure around this, this replica, that we can also include copies of the mourners grieving for the Buddha who surround him in Cave 158. And actually Ananda and Kasyapa are there, and the paintings are also terrific. So we're looking to see what will happen. So going into the entrance, you'll see a huge image of the monumental Buddha in Cave 130. So this one is 27 meters high, a seated Buddha, and hopefully it will take your breath away and give you a sense of awe. It's massive in scale. It will be actually printed on the wall, because that seems to be or printed, but way above. And since it will be obviously two-dimensional, in this entry space, there's too much light to exhibit works of art, so we'll have all the introductory materials, labels, maps, timeline, but the most exciting feature will be a cliff face elevation that will be interactive and electronic. So you'll be able to touch the screen and to see either dynasty by dynasty or century by century, which caves were built in the Tang Dynasty. How did the site evolve? It didn't evolve this way. It evolved, in different ways. But to give people an understanding of how the site developed, this we've decided would be a very effective way to do that. So how did cave building at Dunhuang begin? This is an excerpt from a stele, a 7th century stele at Dunhuang, a big stone inscription on a stone stele that describes a wandering monk who had a vision of golden radiance and in the form of 1,000 Buddhas, and he started to build. He started to make a cave. So that's almost, most sites have a legend, be it legend or true, and this is the one that is always cited with Dunhuang. So also, we'll look at Dunhuang as a major hub on the Silk Road, and the languages that I referred to earlier, the fact that this, the diversity of languages, the diversity of religions that were practiced here, it was multi-ethnic. There was an amazing variety of languages and religions, cultures, artistic traditions, and you have this rich cross-cultural influences. So you have a Jewish prayer in Hebrew, a Buddhist sutra in Tibetan and Chinese, a Uyghur letter. Since the Uyghurs are having so many problems today, we wanted to include Uyghur. And then Gloria in Excelsis Deo in Chinese. So, and there actually are even more. There's a Coptic Turkic manuscript that will be included. Here it's been more a problem of how to keep, not how much can we accommodate and make, how much will a visitor want to see. So who traveled the Silk Road? For the idea that local Buddhism was constantly revitalized by the presence of monks and lay pilgrims who going to and from Central Asia and India, merchants and military. This drawing in ink and color on paper that's in the British Museum, and there are a whole series on this subject that came out of Cave 17. Everything I'm showing you came out of Cave 17. And quite an intriguing face that's clearly non-Chinese. And he carries scrolls on his back. It's really sometimes referred to as a storyteller, but usually as a traveling monk. But there's different versions, always accompanied by a tiger, a symbol of virtue and power. Quite a favorite of mine. But one question, and this is a difficult one, is how not to oversimplify Buddhism. How should we portray it? How can we provide the information? How best to introduce deity's teaching practice? And I think we've decided to do a short video, or to have a short video. If it exists already, that would be wonderful. But with the basic tenets of Buddhism, the origins of the religion of the Buddha and its life, and bodhisattvas and what they represent about Mahayana Buddhism. So it's how can we pack that information in? We also will have scrolls depicting the life of the Buddha, 3 that are wonderful from the British Museum. I'm not going to show them today in the interest of time, but we plan to start out the exhibition with 2 superb Buddha images of the Buddha. And they're both from the British Museum. One's a painting, one's an embroidery. Both came out of Cave 17. This of the Buddha preaching the law, that is thought to be early 8th century. And you can compare it to other 8th century paintings, and both in the caves and also in dated tombs, and find many parallels. He's preaching the law in terms of the Tarka-Budra. And what's so striking, and I wish I could show you a detail, is the use of color to create shading on the faces and to create a sense of volume throughout the painting. And that was in China as well as in the West. But it's very typical of this early painting style. And this is it's one of the great early Chinese paintings. We're really pleased to have it. It has a very strong focus on the Buddha, most likely Shakyamuni, flanked by bodhisattvas and by monks. And there's really interesting variations in the positioning of the figures, that just turning the back, and nothing is stiff or static. It has a freshness and a vitality, which when you see it, you will see how it makes it a very lively painting. So if we have a painting from the 8th century, we also have an embroidery. And this of Shakyamuni preaching on the Vulture Peak. Actually, it doesn't have the right title, but a 5-figure group. And it's said that Taoist Huang actually had used this as a rug and piled all the manuscripts on top of it. But it's actually in beautiful condition. The British Museum has never lent it. And it's monumental in scale. And it is incredible to be able to give a sculptural sense, a 3D sense, to figures when it's embroidery, it's stitching. And it's on a base of hemp with fine silk over it, and then silk stitching. And we're going to have Zhao Feng, who is the director of the Hangzhou Silk Museum, and a very highly respected textile expert, write about it, both in the book and also for the exhibition. And if you look at it, I mean, the stitching is incredible. The face, the cheeks have stitching that's round that gives them volume, but there's just a very light delicacy also in the lines below. But it's generally assumed that because it's needlework, it was done by women. But in fact, there's no reason to exclude the possibility that it was the handiwork of men. And actually, in terms of the organization of artists, I'll just mention, and it's something that Professor Kieschnick brought to my attention. There's a scholar, Mada, who actually has done really interesting work on how artists were organized, how they were paid. There is quite a bit of information on that. Let's go on and look at merit gaining devotion and patronage in another great work. Why were these works created? Who commissioned them and why? One thing we want to do in the exhibition is ask a lot of the basic questions. And certainly merit gaining was primary. And Bodhisattva guiding a deceased soul with the banner hanging off a lotus in one hand, incense burning in the other, and the smoke rises up to this palatial abode up in the heavens. And it's, again, from a sheerly artistic point of view, a terrific work of art. And we want to introduce the Bodhisattva to people who don't know as a representative of Mahayana, the idea of having, working toward enlightenment, toward Buddhahood, but waiting to help all sentient beings, and the idea also that anyone could achieve this state, that anyone could achieve Buddhahood. And that was fundamental to Mahayana and certainly to the fact that it had such broad appeal in China. So why commission a work of art? Why create a work of art? It was a way to accumulate merit for oneself, for one's parents, and to achieve a superior rebirth in the next life. All right, so look at the white banner, and there are wonderful banners, and we're hoping to include these two. So we don't know how were these banners used. That's something that is amongst a whole complex of questions, and they do have these single figures on it here. A Bodhisattva turned with a back with a glass bowl, and Vajrapani carrying a thunderbolt. Certainly they were used in ritual. The shape is very distinctive, and the images on these were also replicated on other banners. So studying them and studying what's the relationship between these objects and the wall paintings. It's actually one of the most challenging issues is how do they relate? Where can you make meaningful connections? Okay, let's go back to merit and the Sutra of the 10 Kings of Hell, which based on the Chinese apocryphal text, the scripture of the 10 Kings, the Wang Shujing, that was probably written in the 8th or 9th century. And Chinese Buddhists believed that after death, you appeared before a series of 10 kings of hell, and one by one, each on a specific day, and they assessed your life, good deeds, bad deeds. If you've done a lot of bad deeds, you might get tortured. And then they, at the end, decide on how you would be reborn. A god, a titanic demon, a human, an animal, a hungry ghost, or a denizen of hell. So it's quite a long process. And actually, these paintings are wonderfully animated. And also, you can see the way the king of hell sitting behind the desk looks very much like a magistrate or a judge. And this is the bureaucracy of hell. we all know what bureaucracies are like. So even in hell, you can't avoid it. So making, replicating, commissioning devotional works was meritorious. And there are dedications. We will translate what's written on in terms of people dedicating them to their parents, etc. Okay, let's come back to replication. So one of the really great objects, and this is confirmed, is the Diamond Sutra. It's the earliest dated, complete woodblock printed book, period. and it's dated 868. It's in the British Library, and they have agreed to lend it. And it's, it just is a very important work. The Buddha, Subhuti, asking about the questions, asking Buddha about the significance of existence. And I always love from the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha responds, "This fleeting life is like a star at dawn, a bubble in a stream, a flash of lightning in a summer cloud, a flickering lamp, a phantom, and a dream." And the colophon at the end, which will also be seen, they actually have remounted and done conservation work on, this was in hand scroll form, but it's made of individual sheets of paper. And now they've separated the individual sheets of paper. And so we will have the frontispiece, and then we'll have the colophon at the end, which states, "Reverently made for universal free distribution on behalf of his two parents by Wang Jie." And then the date, which corresponds to May 11th, 868. So it's one of the challenges is that while this is such a work of such importance, it actually is rather modest looking. And so it's something we're grappling with. And actually there's a beautiful little colored painting in the British Museum that's similar to the frontispiece, and we're likely to put that to kind of draw attention to it. But how can we have visitors realize the importance of this? And it's interesting, the Chinese liked reproduction. Not surprising that they were the ones that China was the first to invent printing. So we also are going to expand on replication, and it's an area of interest of Professor Shen Chuiman, who's a young scholar who teaches at New York University, and she's a member of our team. And she's researched and given considerable thought to the meaning of replication and reproduction in the context of Chinese Buddhist art. So I think that's going to be really great new scholarship. So we have a range of artist materials or tools of replication. The pounce, which was first used in the 9th century when the Tibetans were in control of Dunhuang. And the pounce is made by pricking holes that you can see along the lines, and then tamping it with red cinnabar powder. And on the paper beneath, you get the same interests that serve as a guide for replicating the design. In some other cultures, similar is used with black charcoal powder. But there's a big question here in terms of whether or not pounces were used in the cave paintings. Curiously, the conservators who have studied intensively Cave 85 find no indication of pounces having been used. There were compasses, there were straight edges, there were all sorts of different tools, but they can't find any indication of pounces. So the jury's out. More work needs to be done. We know they were used for portable paintings, and we have actually some quite big pounces that will be in the show as well. And in artistic practice, I won't go into, but accuracy was important. I'm not going to show you any sutras, but copying a sutra, you had to be precise. And there were rules set out within a Buddhist context for how you copied. You did not gain merit if you were sloppy. So you had to be very, very accurate. Okay, in addition, something we do know is that sketches were used. And sketches are very rare. Nobody saved them. Everybody threw them away. But in Cave 17, there were a whole bunch of sketches found. And this is one of the ones that relates directly to wall paintings in the caves. It actually tells you where the figures go, and it gives directions to the wall painters as to where to put these particular figures. So it's a preparatory sketch that the wall painter could use. So one thing we'll do, and I'm not doing a lot of it today, but connecting these materials with a photograph on the label that will connect it to the wall paintings in the cave. And an object that I find totally engaging is, this is on the back of a sutra, and it's doodles. And I mean, it's a little higher than a doodle, but it's a freehand sketch. And quite wonderful of Avalokiteshvara and Vajrapani, but just working out how to paint a foot and heads. And to me, it's so powerful because you can see an artist's mind at work. And this is a very long hand sculpt, but there's a spontaneity and a liveliness that it's just at the moment when the whole use of expressive brush line comes to the fore in Chinese art. Now there's one also class of drawing that is very, of sketch that is very particular to creating a sacred space. And we have two in the show. One is an altar diagram, the other is a mandala. And this is actually to be used as a visual aid when creating a sacred space to recite the Shnisha Vyaja Dharani. I'm sure the Buddhist specialists can say it better than I can. And it's really, how do you set up the ritual space? And you can't see it here because it's not a good, it's not a clear image. But it has different containers. It tells you what to put in the container, tells you where to put the stove, where the master will sit. And it provides literally a diagram for that ritual space. And this is the space in which human encounters deities. And it's very much like a cave temple. So let's go from intersections of spirituality and artistic practice just very quickly to survival, conservation, and preservation, the sort of materiality part of this. So a model conservation project that the Getty and the Dunhuang Academy did was Cave 85. And this is something they worked on from 1997 to 2010. And this is Cave 85, a very big Late Tang cave. It's dated. And this is after, and you can see they don't paint in what's fallen off. That's part of conservation philosophy today, is you stabilize it and you work to make sure other parts don't fall off. And then they put a raised platform with panels that discuss conservation. And it's actually really well done. These caves, the way they were made, they were hewn out of a cliff face of soft composite rock. So it's little rocks in a matrix. And then they were plastered with a mixture of clay, sand, and plant fiber. Paintings were outlined in red and black on a very fine layer of earth and plaster. And then they were filled in with bright mineral pigments, and in some cases with washes of organic pigment. But they're fragile, and they're very different from lime-based frescoes. These actually are secco, if you do it correctly. And what they did in spending more than 10 years on this cave was they developed a model methodology for the conservation of wall paintings. And you can see here, this is one of the losses and the flaking paint. The biggest problem is with salts crystallizing and pushing the paint off and causing, they expand and cause the paint to drop. So this is flaking paint and a loss. And this is examining and documenting. They did a terrific amount of scientific analysis of exactly how the caves were made, what were they made with, and analyzing and diagnosing the problem. And since the salts are the problem, these are both actually pulling the salts out of the cliff and face. And with a very small, you can see how labor intensive it is. And then at the end, they cover it with a big press with paper on the other side. And that actually is another way to pull the salts out of the wall. So 21st century for the Mogao grottos, survival and preservation. One way they've survived is the aridity and the remoteness. But you can see the state. In the 14th century, trade shifted from the Silk Road to by sea. And Central Asia, there were all sorts of, it was unsafe, it was chaotic, and so trade shifted away, and Dunhuang was abandoned. And actually, the conservators, their favorite period is the period of abandonment. So, but this is a photo that Stein took of the cliff face. This is what the cliff face looks like today. And actually, Zhou Enlai gave money to reinforce the cliff face. And they're constantly working to make it better. What are the other threats that threaten the site? Well, sand accumulation and blowing sand. And there's a huge, up on top, a huge sand project that extends with fences and gravel and straw over 15 kilometers. But this has been, long been a problem, is the question of the blowing sand and the damage that it does. But today, one of the really big issues is the massive tourism. And yes, if you go on a VIP tour, you can see the special caves and you're sort of out of this huge mix. They have built a visitor center that is terrific to help manage it, but they've had to study the carrying capacity of the caves. How many people can visit a certain cave at a certain time? One of the problems is the opening of the doors and the changes in humidity. And when the humidity goes up, it activates the salts. So they now monitor it very carefully. But the numbers of people, in the early 90s, it was 30,000 people a year. And in 2012, it was 800,000 people. So, and if they take the tolls off the road on a holiday weekend, they get 18,000 people. So it's a major challenge that they're facing. And of course, the local government, Dunhuang is the biggest cultural attraction. So they want the more people, the better. But Dunhuang is trying to stay within this carrying capacity limits and make everything that is have it carefully controlled. So it's a constant battle. Okay, one other experience. What we plan actually is in a gallery to do Mogao in the 20th and 21st century and technology. And the idea, some of you are probably familiar with Oculus Rift, possibly of providing an immersive tour of the caves. Cave 85, you can't do replicas too big. You could do it with Oculus Rift without too much trouble. So we're in the middle of working out what kind of, how can we harness technology and how can we make it into an educational tool? So it's not just for flash, but it actually is meaningful. I think these are Google glasses or something. Yeah. And then there is a woman in Hong Kong, Sarah Kenderdine, who has done work with Cave 220, and we're looking at what she's done, and part of it is questions of space. But what are the opportunities and challenges? You know, how can we offer multiple complementary experiences of the magnificent of these grottos? And secondly, how can we create a Buddhist as well as a historical and art historical context? So as to reinvest spiritual meaning in the objects. And thirdly, how can we advance scholarship and promote Dunhuang studies in the United States? Curiously, not only China, Japan, and Europe is way ahead of us. Because these library cave materials ended up in Europe and in London and Paris, that's where, and in France has a long tradition of great scholarship on Dunhuang. How can we stimulate that in the United States? And then also, we want to advocate for preserving the fragile world cultural heritage sites. And the Getty they've actually done the China Principles, which are the principles for preserving cultural heritage sites in China. And they also are China's National Center for Wall Painting Conservation. And they're training people for other sites. So all of that is good. Now I will just conclude with a wonderful quote, and which you can read for yourself. Thank you.